Somewhere under a parking lot in Leicester, England, a king had been rotting for 500 years. No coffin, no ceremony, no marker. Just bones pressed into cold dirt while cars parked above him, council workers walked over him, and the entire world forgot he existed. But in 2012, when scientists finally pulled those bones from the earth and ran the DNA, they did not just solve a cold case that was 5 centuries old. They cracked open something far more dangerous. A secret so deep, so old, and so explosive that it does not just threaten the story of one murdered king. It threatens the legitimacy of almost every English monarch who came after him, all the way down to the royal family sitting on the British throne today. This is not a story that textbooks are going to walk you through, because the moment you follow this evidence to its logical end, you arrive at a conclusion that nobody in power wants you to think too hard about. So let us think hard about it together. Let us start at the very beginning. August 22nd, 1485, a battlefield called Bosworth Field. An English king named Richard III found himself surrounded on every side with nowhere left to run. His army had already begun to collapse around him. His allies had switched sides mid-battle, and in his final moments, enemy soldiers tore the helmet clean off his exposed head. Well, what followed was not a clean death. It was a slaughter. Scientists who later studied his bones counted at least 10 separate wounds on that skeleton. 8 of them were carved directly into his skull. These were not random, panicked strikes. These were trained soldiers who had gotten close enough to know exactly where to aim. They wanted to make absolutely certain this man would never rise again, and the brutality did not stop the moment Richard's heart stopped beating. One wound found on his pelvis was inflicted after he was already dead, driven through his clothing while his body lay defenseless on the ground, because that was not enough humiliation for his enemies. They stripped his corpse completely naked, slung it over the back of a horse like a sack of grain, and paraded it through the streets of Leicester for the entire city to see. A king dragged through the dirt in death so that no one would ever dare rally behind his name again. Then they threw him into a rushed, unmarked grave and walked away. And that was where Richard III stayed for the next 527 years. History moved on. The city of Leicester grew up around him. Gardens were planted over his grave, then buildings, then eventually a simple parking lot reserved for city council workers. Nobody who ever walked across that asphalt knew what was sleeping beneath their feet. Historians had quietly written off any hope of ever finding his remains. The trail had gone cold generations ago. Some rumors even circulated that his bones had been dug up at some point and thrown into a nearby river. Most people chose to believe the mystery was simply unsolvable and let it go, which is exactly what made the decision made in 2012 sound almost laughable when it was first announced. A team of archaeologists decided to dig up a council car park in the middle of Leicester. They had old historical maps that suggested a medieval friary once stood on that exact site, and that Richard had been buried somewhere within its walls. Nobody took the bet seriously. The smart money said they would find old bricks and broken pottery, maybe some coins, and go home empty-handed. Within days of breaking through the asphalt, they found a complete human skeleton. And it was lying precisely where a 500-year-old record said Richard's grave should be, in the section of the friary believed to be the choir area. A parking lot had swallowed a king whole for over 5 centuries, and it finally spat him back out the moment someone thought to look. The skeleton, labeled simply as Skeleton 1 by the team, immediately started telling its story. The man it belonged to had died in his early 30s. Richard was 32 years old at the Battle of Bosworth. But it was the spine that stopped everyone cold. The bones showed a severe case of scoliosis, a condition that curves the spine dramatically to one side and would have left one shoulder sitting noticeably higher than the other. People who actually knew Richard while he was alive had written about his uneven shoulders in their own records. William Shakespeare had taken that one physical detail and inflated it into the image of a grotesque, limping, hunchbacked monster that the entire world still pictures today whenever Richard's name comes up. But the real bones told a completely different story. Richard was not a creature from a nightmare. He had a genuine medical condition, one that almost certainly began when he was still a young teenager. He grew into adulthood, trained as a knight, and led armies into battle his entire life while quietly carrying this condition every single day. Whatever private difficulty or pain it caused him, it never stopped him from fighting on the front lines like every other man at Bosworth Field. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the bones belonged to someone who died in the late 1400s, exactly when Richard was killed. Chemical analysis of his teeth revealed a diet loaded with expensive meat and rich seafood, the kind of food available only to the wealthiest people in the entire country. Even the teeth of this rotting skeleton were quietly announcing that this had been a man of extraordinary power and wealth. But the darkest detail of all was still waiting in the soil. Samples taken from around his pelvis revealed the eggs of roundworm parasites. The anointed king of England, the man who commanded armies and wore the crown, had been walking around infested with intestinal worms in the final weeks of his life. a condition typically associated with the poorest and most desperate people of that era. And yet, it had been living inside a king. To add insult to that indignity, there was no coffin found in that grave, no burial shroud. The positioning of the bones strongly suggested that Richard's hands may have actually been bound together at the time he was thrown in. A crowned king of England buried like a common criminal. Every single one of those bones had screamed its story for 5 centuries, waiting for someone to finally listen. And now someone had. But bone and soil could only confirm so much. To close this case beyond any reasonable doubt, scientists needed something deeper than physical evidence. They needed to crack open the blood itself. And what they found there was where everything got truly dangerous. The challenge of pulling usable DNA from bones that had been in the ground for 500 years is immense. In most cases, it would be flatly impossible. But the human body carries 2 specific types of genetic information that have an extraordinary ability to survive intact across many generations. The first is mitochondrial DNA, which passes only from a mother down to her children and stays almost completely unchanged across centuries. The second is the Y-chromosome, which passes only from a father down to his sons, generation after generation. Scientists had a real shot at solving this mystery, but only if they could find living people who still carried either of those genetic threads, connecting them back to Richard. Genealogists went to work and chased Richard's family tree through his sister, Anne of York. They followed an unbroken chain of mothers and daughters across 19 generations and 500 years. That is not a simple search through a couple of dusty church records. That meant hunting down marriage certificates, birth registers, and family trees spread across multiple countries and multiple centuries, while praying that not a single break in the female line had already destroyed the entire trail somewhere along the way. Somehow, against every odd stacked against them, they found 2 living people sitting at the very end of that impossibly long chain. One was Michael Ibsen, a furniture maker living quietly in London with absolutely no idea that his own blood connected him to a murdered king. The other was Wendy Doldig, a researcher living in Canada. Both of them turned out to be direct descendants of Richard III through his sister's line. 2 ordinary people living ordinary lives, holding the genetic key to unlocking one of England's oldest unsolved mysteries. When the lab results came back, they were stunning. One of the 2 relatives matched the DNA from the bones perfectly. The second was nearly identical, differing by just one tiny variation that changed nothing about the overall conclusion. The odds of this happening by pure coincidence were so microscopically small, they were essentially 0. The University of Leicester stood before the world and made it official. Beyond any reasonable doubt, the skeleton buried under that Leicester parking lot was King Richard III. Case closed after 529 years. Newspapers ran the story on their front pages. Historians celebrated. And for a brief moment, it felt like every question about Richard III had finally been put to rest forever. But the mitochondrial DNA was only ever half of the story, and the other half was about to blow the entire mystery wide open in a direction nobody had anticipated. Scientists then turned to the Y-chromosome, the DNA that travels only from father to son. If Richard truly was who everyone now believed him to be, his Y-chromosome should have matched other living men who shared descent from the same royal Plantagenet bloodline through the male line. Researchers traced that male descent all the way to the Somerset family, direct descendants of Henry Somerset, the 5th Duke of Beaufort. 5 living men from this family stepped forward and agreed to be tested, most likely expecting nothing more than a quiet formality that would simply confirm what everyone already believed to be true. Before scientists had even compared a single one of them to Richard's bones, something strange was already crawling out of the results. 4 of the 5 Somerset men matched each other perfectly on the Y-chromosome. The 5th man did not match the other 4 at all. These men all supposedly shared the exact same great-great-grandfather on paper, and yet one of them carried completely different paternal DNA. That mismatch alone meant that a hidden affair had already taken place somewhere inside this noble family within the past few hundred years. A wife, somewhere in that family's recent history, had kept a secret from her husband. Generations of descendants had carried the family name without ever knowing the truth. But that private family scandal was only the opening act. When scientists finally compared Richard's own Y-chromosome against the Somerset men, not a single one of them matched him. Not one. Somewhere across the 19 generations, separating Richard from their shared Plantagenet ancestor, what scientists carefully described as a false paternity event had taken place. Strip away the polite scientific language and the meaning is brutally simple. Somewhere along that long chain of fathers and sons, one child's official father was not his real biological father. Someone had lied. Someone had cheated. And that lie had been buried so perfectly that it survived 5 centuries completely undisturbed. Think carefully about what that actually means. In an era with absolutely 0 privacy, no paternity tests, and no possible way to ever expose the truth once a child had been born, A woman somewhere inside this royal family had a child with a man who was not her husband. That child grew up completely unaware of the truth, inherited a name, inherited land and power and titles, and carried the bloodline forward as if nothing had ever happened. The secret worked flawlessly for 500 years straight, hidden in plain sight, under everyone's nose. Whoever she was, she took that secret to her grave. And the men who followed her, generation after generation, lived and died believing a lie about their own blood. And when you run the numbers, this outcome was almost statistically inevitable. Genealogists estimate that in any single generation, there is roughly a 1 to 2% chance that a child's recorded father is not the biological father. That sounds small, but stack that risk across 19 separate generations, and the probability of at least one break occurring somewhere in that chain rockets up to somewhere between 20 and 40%. In other words, a hidden secret like this was never just possible across 500 years of royal history. It was practically guaranteed. But what made this discovery infinitely more explosive than simply one broken link in a noble family tree was the question of exactly when and exactly where that break occurred. Because scientists studying the data pointed at something chilling. One second test, run on a man named Patrice de Warren, who claimed descent from a much older branch of the same Plantagenet family, going all the way back to the 1100s, also came back with no match. Two completely separate mismatches, through two completely different genealogical paths. That was not a 1 in a million accident. That was a pattern. And it meant the break in this royal bloodline may have happened far earlier than anyone had first assumed. Perhaps all the way back at the very foundation of the Plantagenet dynasty itself. Scientists were careful with their public statements. The lead researcher, Kevin Schurer, stood before cameras and said clearly that the team was not in any way suggesting that the current British royal family had no right to the throne. Claims to royal power, he noted, rest on much more than simply biological descent. They rest on battlefield victories, marriages, parliamentary decisions, and centuries of established tradition. All of that is true and fair. But it does not make the underlying question disappear. It just makes it more uncomfortable to sit with. Because here is what the historical record actually shows when you follow it honestly. Both the House of York, which was Richard's own family, and the House of Lancaster, their sworn enemies, claimed descent from the same common ancestor, a king named Edward III. And they spent decades tearing England apart in a conflict known as the Wars of the Roses, a savage struggle during which entire noble families were wiped out. Captured men were executed on the spot, purely because of which bloodline they carried, and thousands of ordinary soldiers bled out on battlefield after battlefield. All of it fought over one burning question. Which family carried the one true legitimate blood right to sit on the English throne? Now consider what modern DNA science has quietly revealed. The idea of an unbroken, verifiable, pure royal bloodline running through either family may never have truly existed at all. And then there is the rumor, the one that has circulated through the back corridors of English history for over 500 years, and that the DNA discovery now makes impossible to simply laugh off and forget. The story centers on a woman named Cecily Neville, Richard's own mother, and the accusation is that her eldest son, the man who became King Edward IV, the father of the famous princes in the Tower, was never actually the son of his recorded father, Richard, Duke of York. The story goes that while Richard, Duke of York, was away on military campaign in France, Cecily, who was based in the nearby city of Rouen, had an affair with a common archer from the garrison, a man remembered only by the name Blayborn. Edward was born not long after this period of separation, and that suspicious timing has fueled the rumor ever since. Italian scholar Dominic Mancini wrote the story down in 1483. King Louis VIII of France reportedly called Edward by the archer's name to his face as a deliberate insult. And the rumor, according to Mancini's account, may have originated with Cecily herself, who became so furious when Edward secretly married a commoner named Elizabeth Woodville that she threatened to publicly declare her own son a bastard rather than simply accept his bride. A mother so consumed with rage that she was reportedly willing to destroy her son's entire claim to the throne of England out of pure spite. Most historians today believe the Blayborn story was political slander weaponized by Edward's enemies, and the evidence against it is reasonable. Cecily was a woman of legendary pride and deep religious conviction. The distance between Rouen and Pontoise, while significant, was not as impossibly far as some have claimed, and Richard, Duke of York, gave no recorded indication during his lifetime that he ever doubted Edward was his son. But here is the uncomfortable truth that the DNA evidence leaves behind. You do not need the Blayborn story to be true in order for this entire foundation to be cracked. The Y-chromosome mismatch already proves, scientifically and definitively, that somewhere in this royal bloodline, a break occurred. The exact identity of the woman who kept that secret and the identity of the man she kept it with may never be known. But the break itself is not a theory anymore. It is a scientific fact confirmed by the bones of a dead king pulled from beneath a parking lot. Follow this chain all the way through and the implications become staggering. If Edward IV was not the biological son of Richard, Duke of York, then his claim to the throne of England was never legitimate from the very beginning. If his throne was never legitimate, then his daughter Elizabeth of York never carried a genuine, unbroken royal bloodline into her own marriage. And that marriage, between Elizabeth of York and Henry Tudor, was the specific union designed to end the Wars of the Roses, unite the warring houses of Lancaster and York, and hand the entire Tudor dynasty its foundation of legitimacy. Every king and queen who descended from that union carried their right to rule forward on the assumption that Elizabeth of York's blood was genuine and unbroken. That assumption included Henry VIII. It included Edward VI. It included Mary of Warren and Elizabeth I. And the line of descent from the Tudor dynasty runs forward through various twists and turns of English royal history, all the way down to the monarchy that exists today. The DNA pulled from the bones of a man buried under a parking lot in Leicester has placed a question mark over the entire chain. Not a question that strips anyone of their modern throne, because thrones in the 21st century do not rest on medieval bloodlines alone, but a question that history books have been quietly avoiding. Because the honest answer is this: the crown of England, from the Plantagenets through the Tudors, was never built on the pure, unbroken, divinely ordained bloodline that those dynasties insisted they carried. It was built, at least in part, on a secret that a woman took to her grave somewhere in the 1400s, and that nobody discovered until a team of scientists cracked open the DNA of a skeleton someone dug out of the ground in 2012. The king who was stripped naked and paraded through the streets of Leicester in 1485 ended up being the man who, in death, exposed a crack running through the entire foundation of English royal history. That is not a story textbooks are comfortable telling, but the bones already told it. 500 years ago, underneath a parking space, waiting for someone to finally ask the right questions. Now you have heard the answers.